Hello, and welcome back to GCSE History Lessons. In this lesson, we'll begin Topic 2 of the Cold War History Unit by examining the lead up to the 1961 Berlin Crisis. In Topic 1, we looked at how and why the Cold War began, as well as the major ideas central to the Cold War. In Topic 2, we will look at three major crises of the Cold War. To do this, each crisis will be broken into two lessons. First, we will look at the background and lead up to the crisis, and then we will discuss the actual events and consequences of the crisis. By the end of this lesson, you should understand the events leading up to the Berlin crisis of 1961, especially the details of Khrushchev's ultimatum. You will remember from Topic 1 that Berlin had been divided between Western and Eastern zones, along with Germany itself. We also saw that the Cold War was as much an ideological battle as it was a military and political one, with the USSR and USA determined to show that their brand of civilization was the best. By 1949, West Berlin was still administered by the US, UK, and France, but it was inside the socialist German Democratic Republic, and the east of the city was still under Soviet control. As tensions between the USA and USSR rose, Berlin became a Cold War flashpoint, as Russian and American troops and Russian and American civilizations faced off across the east-west Berlin border. The last time we covered Berlin in this course was the Berlin airlift, but after the airlift, the city and Germany, in general, had become a lot more dangerous. Under the new US President Eisenhower, the USA intended to rely on nuclear force to cut spending on other areas of the army, just as Khrushchev was doing for the Soviet Union. The strategy of massive retaliation was adopted by the US, which Eisenhower explained in October 1953 as meaning, in the event of hostilities, the United States will consider nuclear weapons to be as available for use as other munitions. Therefore, both NATO's and Warsaw Pact's military strategy during the 50s was that a European war would be a nuclear war. This heightened tensions greatly when West Germany was admitted to NATO in May 1955. The USA intended to replace US troops there with German and European troops to cut military spending. The threat of nuclear war rose again when Adenauer, the leader of West Germany at the time, said in April 1957 that nuclear weapons are nothing more than the further development of artillery. They are normal weapons. We need to remember this when we talk about Berlin and Germany during the 50s and 60s. At the time, it was widely seen that a shot fired by either side would quickly lead to a massive nuclear war in Europe. So, in the 1950s, there was a clear and growing military power imbalance between West Germany and East Germany. But there was also an economic imbalance, and it was the difference in economic opportunity between the East and West that was the real catalyst for the Berlin crisis in 1961. The German Democratic Republic, East Germany, in the 1950s, had serious problems. Nearly 1 in 5 of its inhabitants in 1950 were people who had been expelled from Poland as the new Polish state was propped up. Unemployment was over 12%, and 20% of the housing units destroyed in the war had not yet been rebuilt. Of the people who did have houses, 2 in 3 had no living room, and less than half had access to a bath. East Germany had been the main target of Soviet reparations, with 1/4 of its industry being dismantled after 1945 and moved to Russia. The GDR was then forced to pay 20 to 30% of its GDP in deliveries to the USSR in further reparations. By the end of 1951, nearly 500,000 people had moved west, out of the total population of 19 million people. In the meantime, West Germany had been rebuilt by American and British funds. Its wealthy industries boomed as war broke out in Korea in the 1950s, during which time the FIG's economy grew at 7 or 8% every year. By 1959, West Germany was producing nearly a fifth of world exports of manufactured goods. In March and April 1952, Stalin suggested to the West that they should reunite Germany as an armed but neutral state. But the West were about to sign a European Defence Community Treaty to arm West Germany with a European force, and they saw this as an attempt by Stalin to disrupt their own plans. They decided to go ahead with this treaty on May 27, 1952, one day after the GDR decided to seal off the border between the two Germanys with barbed wire. So, as the German Democratic Republic moved towards socialism in the east, many people attempted to flee across the border into the west. The rate of emigration from east to west rose in March 1953 to 301,000 people. In fact, as many as 2.7 million East Germans defected to the west between 1949 and 1961. Most of these people fled from East Berlin to West Berlin, and from there they could fly to West Germany. Especially troubling was the brain drain, as many of the country's intelligent and young people moved out. When Stalin died, there was discussion in Moscow about allowing German reunification regardless of whether it was socialist or not. But Khrushchev would not hand over 18 million Germans to the rule of American imperialists. The new leader of the USSR proposed a new course for the USSR relations in the East, as part of de-Stalinization. But the reforms in the GDR led to explosive protests in June 1953. About 3% of East Germans took to the streets, forcing the Soviets to impose martial law in East Berlin, recognize the GDR as a sovereign state, stop taking reparations, and pour substantial aid back into the GDR to stop it from collapsing. Now, instead of simply using the GDR to extract reparations from Germany after the war, the Soviets were committed to East Germany. Once again, the question of reunification was buried. With the refugees fleeing his country, leader of the GDR, Walter Ulbricht, knew Khrushchev had now committed the USSR to keeping East Germany alive as a viable state, and he played on Khrushchev's fears that the East Germany might collapse if the flood of refugees continued any longer. On November 10, 1958, Khrushchev gave a speech in Moscow providing the West with an ultimatum. He demanded the Western powers withdraw their troops from Berlin within 6 months so that the city could become a demilitarized city. If they did not, he would hand over communications control of the entire city to the East German government. But US President Eisenhower believed a military presence in Berlin was necessary to protect West Berlin's freedom. Summits were held in Geneva in May and Camp David in September 1959. No agreement on the fate of Berlin was reached, but Khrushchev withdrew his ultimatum. The parties agreed to meet again in Paris the next year to make further agreements. So, to summarise what we've learned today, Berlin was a dangerous place in the 1950s. Trying to cut back on military spending, both the USA and USSR had decided to use the threat of nuclear weapons so that conventional armies became obsolete. American and Russian troops still faced off along the east-west Berlin border. The situation became more dangerous when West Germany was admitted to NATO, and Western European nations were in the middle of creating the European Defence Community Treaty, which would arm West Germany with a powerful European army. There was a growing power and economic imbalance between East Germany and West Germany during the 1950s. Stalin and GDR leader Ulbricht were faced with the humiliation of hundreds of thousands of East Germans fleeing to the west. The GDR sealed the border between it and the FRG, but refugees continued to flee via Berlin. Khrushchev took over after Stalin died and imposed new reforms which sparked massive unrest in the GDR. They forced Khrushchev to commit to their state despite its problems. Fearing the GDR would collapse, which would be disastrous, Khrushchev sought to put pressure on the West to create a demilitarized free city of Berlin. Otherwise, he would hand over communications controls with West Berlin to the GDR government. At summits in Geneva and Camp David, Khrushchev dropped his ultimatum, but no agreement was made on Berlin. Further talks were scheduled for Paris next year, 1960. Next lesson, we'll look at the 1961 Berlin crisis, including the standoff at Checkpoint Charlie and the construction of the Berlin Wall. Thanks for watching. Feel free to like and subscribe, and I'll see you next time on GCSE History Lessons.